Young schoolteacher fell for a sheriff. Unaware he was the very outlaw she hunted in class, she taught her students to hate the outlaw whose face hung on her wall, never knowing she was falling in love with him every evening at sunset. The morning sun slanted through the schoolhouse windows, casting long shadows across the rough wooden floor where Eleanor Hayes stood before her students. Dust motes danced in the golden light like tiny spirits, and the smell of chalk and autumn leaves filled the small room that served as both classroom and chapel for the growing town of Millbrook. "Children," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who believed deeply in the power of right and wrong. "Today we're going to talk about justice." She moved to the wall where several wanted posters hung like grim decorations, their edges curled from the desert heat. Her finger traced the air near one particular poster. A man's face stared back from the yellowed paper, dark eyes beneath a weathered hat, a scar cutting across his left cheek like a question mark. "This man," she continued, tapping the poster gently, "is called Black Jack Morrison. He's stolen from honest folk, robbed stagecoaches, and some say he's killed men in cold blood." The children leaned forward, their young faces a mixture of fascination and fear. "But what does his story teach us?" 8-year-old Tommy raised his dirt-stained hand. "That bad men get what's coming to them, Miss Hayes?" Eleanor smiled, the expression lighting up her plain but kind face. "That's right, Tommy. Justice may be slow, but always finds its way home, like water finding the lowest ground. Truth has a way of settling where it belongs." She turned back to the poster, studying the outlaw's face with the intensity of someone trying to memorize an enemy. The artist had captured something haunting in those eyes, not just cruelty, but a kind of desperate sadness that made her stomach twist with something she couldn't quite name. Outside, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made the children's heads turn toward the windows. Eleanor felt her heart quicken, as it had every day for the past month when that particular rhythm announced the arrival of Sheriff John Morrison. He'd been coming by the school regularly, always with some official reason, checking on the children's safety, delivering messages from their parents, ensuring the building was secure. But Eleanor knew better. She'd seen the way his eyes lingered on her face when he thought she wasn't looking, noticed how he always seemed to time his visits for when the children were at recess, giving them a chance to talk quietly in the doorway. The door creaked open, and John's tall frame filled the entrance. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair that caught the light the same way the outlaw's did in the poster behind him. But where the wanted man's face was hard and scarred, John's was gentle, marked only by laugh lines and the weathering that came from honest work under an honest sun. "Morning, Miss Hayes," he said, his voice carrying that soft drawl that made her name sound like a prayer. "Hope I'm not disturbing your lesson." "Not at all, Sheriff," Eleanor replied, though she could feel her cheeks warming. "We were just discussing the importance of justice." John's eyes flicked to the wanted posters, and for just a moment, something flickered across his face. So quick Eleanor almost missed it. Pain, maybe, or recognition. "Justice," he repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the word. "That's a heavy topic for young minds." "Heavy topics build strong character," Eleanor said, moving closer to him, close enough to catch the scent of leather and sage that seemed to follow him everywhere. "Don't you think it's important they understand the difference between right and wrong?" John was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from the children to Eleanor's face, then back to the poster of Black Jack Morrison. When he spoke, his voice was softer than usual. "I think the world's more complicated than we sometimes want it to be, Miss Hayes. Good and bad. Sometimes they get all twisted up together like rope in a storm." Eleanor frowned slightly. This wasn't the response she'd expected from a lawman. "Surely you don't believe that evil should go unpunished?" "No," John said quickly, too quickly. "No, I think sometimes people do bad things for reasons that ain't entirely bad. And sometimes," he trailed off, looking out the window at the vast expanse of prairie that stretched toward the horizon. "Sometimes a man can change if he's given the chance." The children had grown restless during their conversation, and Eleanor clapped her hands to regain their attention. "All right, everyone, time for arithmetic." Sheriff Morrison, would you mind helping Jimmy with his sums? He's been struggling with subtraction. John nodded, grateful for the distraction. As he knelt beside the boy's desk, Eleanor couldn't help but notice how gentle he was with the child, how patiently he explained the problems. There was something almost fatherly in his manner, though she knew he had no children of his own. Miss Hayes, little Sarah's voice broke through her observations. Why does that outlaw look sad? Eleanor turned back to the wanted poster, studying Black Jack Morrison's face with fresh eyes. Sarah was right. There was something profoundly sad in those dark eyes, a weight that spoke of loss rather than malice. I don't know, Sarah, Eleanor said honestly. Perhaps even bad men carry sadness with them. From across the room, John's pencil snapped in his grip. The rest of the morning passed in the comfortable rhythm of lessons and laughter, but Eleanor found herself distracted by the sheriff's presence. There was something different about him today, a tension in his shoulders, a careful way he held himself, as if he were afraid of breaking something precious. When the children filed out for their afternoon recess, Eleanor and John stood alone in the sudden quiet of the empty schoolroom. Dust settled in the wake of small feet, and the wanted posters fluttered slightly in the breeze from the open door. Miss Hayes, John said, his voice carrying a strange urgency. Eleanor, there's something I need to tell you. She turned to face him fully, noting the way his hands twisted the brim of his hat, the way his eyes seemed to be fighting some internal battle. What is it, John? But before he could answer, the sound of children's laughter drifted in from outside, and the moment shattered like glass. John straightened, the sheriff's mask sliding back over his features. Nothing important, he said, though his voice suggested otherwise. Just be careful, Eleanor. There are dangerous men in this world, and they don't always look the part. As he turned to leave, Eleanor caught his arm. John, wait. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, solid and real and achingly familiar. Whatever it is you wanted to say, I'm here. I'll listen. For a moment, he looked like he might crumble under the weight of whatever secret he carried. His free hand reached toward her face, almost touching her cheek before falling away. I know you will, he whispered. That's what scares me most. After he left, Eleanor stood alone among the dancing dust and fading light, staring at the wanted poster that seemed to mock her with its hollow-eyed gaze. She thought about John's words, about the sadness Sarah had seen in an outlaw's face, about the way her heart raced whenever the sheriff was near. Something was shifting in the foundation of her carefully ordered world, like sand sliding beneath her feet. She just didn't know how far she might fall. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that shadows were growing longer around her heart, and that the man she was learning to love might be carrying secrets as heavy as the desert stones. Every evening walk, every gentle touch, every whispered word of love was built on a lie so dangerous it could destroy them both. October painted Millbrook in shades of gold and amber, and Eleanor Hayes found herself walking through it like a woman in a dream. 3 weeks had passed since that strange moment in the schoolhouse, when Sheriff John Morrison had almost spoken some secret that seemed to burn behind his eyes. Since then, he'd returned to his gentle courtship with a kind of desperate tenderness that made her heart ache in the most beautiful way. You're quiet tonight, John said as they walked the dusty Main Street after supper. The setting sun cast their shadows long across the ground, two figures moving in perfect step as if they'd been walking together for years instead of weeks. Eleanor glanced up at him, noting how the evening light caught the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark eyes seemed to hold depth she couldn't quite fathom. I was thinking about my students. Tommy asked me today why some people choose to be bad when being good is so much easier. John's step faltered almost imperceptibly. What did you tell him? That I didn't know, Eleanor admitted, her voice soft in the cooling air. But that's not true, is it? I do know. I think people become outlaws because they're weak. Because when life gets hard, they take the easy path instead of doing what's right. They'd stopped walking without realizing it, standing now in front of the general store where lamplight spilled golden squares onto the wooden walkway. John turned to face her fully, and something in his expression made Eleanor's breath catch. "Do you really believe that?" he asked, his voice carrying a weight she'd never heard before. "That it's always about weakness?" Eleanor studied his face, seeing pain etched in the lines around his eyes. "John, what happened to you before you came to Millbrook? You never speak of your past." For a moment, she thought he might tell her. His mouth opened slightly, and his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Then a group of cowboys rode past, their laughter breaking the spell, and John stepped back. "Some things are better left buried," he said quietly. "The past has a way of poisoning the present if you let it." That night, Eleanor lay awake in her small room above the schoolhouse, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the shadows that seemed to follow John Morrison like faithful dogs. She'd grown up believing the world was painted in clear strokes of black and white, right and wrong. But John's presence in her life was adding shades of gray she'd never noticed before. The next morning brought news that made her blood run cold. Mrs. Patterson burst into the schoolhouse during arithmetic lesson, her face flushed from running. "Miss Hayes," she gasped, "there's been another robbery. The stage from Silver Creek was hit yesterday. They say it was Black Jack Morrison's gang." Eleanor felt the familiar surge of righteous anger that always accompanied news of the outlaw's crimes. Were there injuries? The driver was shot, but he'll live. They took everything, though, including the payroll for the mining company. Mrs. Patterson glanced at the children, then lowered her voice. "They say Black Jack himself wasn't there, but his men were bold as brass. Left his calling card and everything." After Mrs. Patterson left, Eleanor stood before the wanted poster with renewed fury. The face that stared back at her seemed to mock her peaceful town, her orderly world, her belief in justice. "Children," she said, her voice ringing with conviction, "this is why we study the difference between right and wrong. This is why we must never compromise with evil. Men like Black Jack Morrison are a poison in our society. They take what honest people have earned through hard work. They spread fear and violence wherever they go." Little Sarah raised her hand. "But Miss Hayes, what if an outlaw wanted to change? What if he was sorry for what he did?" Eleanor's jaw tightened. "Some crimes are too great for sorry, Sarah. Some men go so far down the dark path that they can never find their way back to the light. That's why we must catch them and make them pay for their crimes." From the doorway, a sharp intake of breath made her turn. John stood there, his face white as bleached bone, one hand gripping the door frame so tightly his knuckles had gone bloodless. "Sheriff," Eleanor said, her voice still carrying the passion of her convictions, "I was just telling the children about yesterday's robbery. Isn't it time we organized a real effort to catch this Black Jack Morrison? How many more innocent people will suffer while he runs free?" John's eyes moved from Eleanor's flushed face to the wanted poster, then back again. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Justice ain't always as simple as we'd like it to be, Miss Hayes." "It's exactly that simple," Eleanor replied firmly. "Wrong is wrong, John. You of all people should understand that. You wear a badge. You've sworn to uphold the law." Something died in John's eyes then, a light that had been flickering there since the day they met. He straightened slowly, and when he looked at her again, it was with the expression of a man staring across an unbridgeable chasm. "Yes," he said quietly, "I suppose I have." That evening, John didn't come for their usual walk. Eleanor waited on the schoolhouse steps as the sun set, painting the sky the color of old blood. When full darkness fell, and he still hadn't appeared, she walked to the sheriff's office. She found him sitting behind his desk in the lamplight, staring at a collection of papers spread before him. He looked up when she entered, and she was shocked by the haggard expression on his face. "John, what's wrong? You look like you haven't slept in days." He gathered the papers quickly, but not before she caught a glimpse of what looked like maps and correspondence. "Just work, Eleanor. Nothing for you to worry about." She moved closer, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands shook slightly as he shuffled the documents. "Talk to me, please. Something's been eating at you for weeks now." John was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "What would you do, Eleanor, if you discovered that someone you cared about had done terrible things? If you found out they weren't who you thought they were?" The question sent a chill down her spine. I suppose it would depend on what they'd done, and whether they were truly sorry for it. But what if sorry wasn't enough? John's dark eyes searched her face desperately. What if the things they'd done were so bad that no amount of regret could wash them clean? Eleanor reached across the desk and placed her hand over his. His skin was cold, and she could feel the rapid beat of his pulse. "John, whatever this is about, we can face it together. I believe people can change if they truly want to. I believe in redemption." For a moment, hope flickered in his eyes like a candle flame in wind. Then he pulled his hand away and stood abruptly. "Do you?" he asked, his voice bitter. Even for men like Black Jack Morrison? The name hit Eleanor like a slap. She drew back, her own voice hardening. "That's different. He's a killer, John. A thief and a murderer. Some people go too far to ever come back." John turned away from her, staring out the window at the dark street. "Yes," he whispered. "I suppose they do." Eleanor left the sheriff's office that night with her heart heavy as stone. Something was breaking between them, and she didn't understand what or why. All she knew was that the man she was falling in love with seemed to be slipping away from her like water through her fingers. Back in her room, she sat by the window and watched the stars emerge one by one in the vast prairie sky. Somewhere out there, Black Jack Morrison was planning his next crime, spreading more pain and fear through their territory. And somewhere in the darkness of his own heart, John Morrison was fighting battles she couldn't see or understand. The autumn wind whispered through the gap under her door, carrying with it the scent of change and the promise that winter was coming. Eleanor wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and wondered why she felt like she was standing at the edge of a precipice, with the ground crumbling beneath her feet. She didn't know that 2 miles away, in an abandoned cabin outside of town, John Morrison sat with his head in his hands, surrounded by maps of stage routes and letters from men whose names appeared on wanted posters throughout the territory. Men who had once called him brother. Men who would see him dead before they let him walk away from the life he'd built with blood and bullets. Men who knew exactly where to find the woman he loved. The dance of deception was reaching its crescendo, and soon the music would stop, leaving only silence and the terrible truth that some secrets are too heavy for love to bear. The moment his old gang rode into town, John Morrison knew his two worlds were about to collide, and the woman he loved would be caught in the wreckage. The first cold snap of November arrived like a slap across Millbrook's face, bringing with it 3 riders who sat their horses like men comfortable with violence. Eleanor noticed them from her classroom window during the children's morning recitation. Strangers with hard eyes and trail dust thick on their clothes, studying the town with the calculating gaze of wolves sizing up a flock. She thought nothing of it at first. Drifters passed through Millbrook regularly, drawn by rumors of work or the promise of anonymity that frontier towns offered. But something about these men made her skin crawl, an instinctive warning that whispered danger in her bones. "Miss Hayes," little Tommy called from his desk, "you're not listening to my reading." Eleanor pulled her attention back to the classroom, offering the boy an apologetic smile. "I am sorry, Tommy. Please continue with the passage about Abraham Lincoln." But her eyes kept drifting to the window, watching the 3 riders as they made their way down Main Street with the slow deliberation of men who had nowhere urgent to be. The tallest of them, a lean man with silver threading his dark beard, kept looking toward the sheriff's office with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read. It was during the lunch recess that everything changed. Eleanor had sent the children outside to play in the crisp autumn air and was organizing papers at her desk when raised voices from the street made her look up. Through the window, she could see the 3 strangers confronting Sheriff Morrison in front of the general store. Even from a distance, the tension between them was palpable. John's posture was rigid, his hands hanging loose at his sides in a way that reminded Eleanor of a gunfighter preparing to draw. The silver-bearded man was doing most of the talking, gesturing emphatically while his companions flanked him like bodyguards. Eleanor couldn't hear the words, but she could read the body language clearly enough. This wasn't a friendly conversation between strangers asking for directions. This was a confrontation between people who knew each other well and didn't part on good terms. Her heart began to race as she watched John shake his head repeatedly, backing toward his office while the strangers pressed closer. The silver-bearded man's face was twisted with what looked like anger and betrayal, while his companions kept their hands near their guns. When John finally turned and walked quickly toward the sheriff's office, the three men watched him go with expressions that made Eleanor's blood run cold. There was something predatory in their gaze, the look of hunters who had cornered their prey. That evening, Eleanor waited for John on the schoolhouse steps as she had every night for weeks. But tonight felt different. The air carried a bitter edge that had nothing to do with the coming winter, and shadows seemed to gather in places they had no business being. When John finally appeared, walking up the dusty street with his hat pulled low, Eleanor was shocked by his appearance. His face was haggard, his clothes disheveled, and his eyes held a haunted quality that made him look like a man staring into his own grave. "John," she said, rising to meet him, "what happened today? I saw you talking to those strangers. You looked scared." John's laugh was bitter as old coffee. "Yeah, I expect I did." Eleanor reached for his hand, finding it cold and trembling. "Who were they? What do they want?" John was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the empty street as if expecting those three riders to emerge from the shadows. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Ghosts, Eleanor. They were ghosts from a life I thought I'd buried. I don't understand." John turned to face her. In the lamplight spilling from the schoolhouse window, she could see tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. "There are things about my past that I've never told you. Things I'm ashamed of. Things that could destroy everything good I've tried to build here." Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. "John, whatever is, we can face it together. I told you that before. Can we?" John's voice cracked like breaking glass. "What if I told you that the man you think you know doesn't really exist? What if I told you that everything I've shown you has been a lie?" "Stop it." Eleanor gripped his hands tighter, forcing him to meet her gaze. "I know who you are, John Morrison. I see it in the way you treat the children, the way you protect this town, the way you—" "The way I what, Eleanor?" "The way you love me," she whispered. For a moment, John's mask slipped completely, and she saw the raw pain beneath, the agony of a man torn between two worlds. He raised one shaking hand to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with desperate tenderness. "That's the only true thing left in me," he said. "Everything else is shadow and lies." Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made them both turn. The three strangers rode slowly up Main Street, their eyes fixed on John with unmistakable intent. The silver-bearded man touched the brim of his hat in mock politeness as they passed. "Evening, Jack," he called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Lovely night for old friends to catch up." Eleanor felt John's entire body go rigid beside her. The name the stranger had used, Jack, hit her like a physical blow. She looked up at John's face and saw confirmation in his expression, the way his jaw tightened and his eyes went flat and cold. "Who is Jack?" she asked quietly. John didn't answer. His attention was fixed on the three riders as they disappeared into the darkness beyond the town limits. Only when their hoofbeats had faded completely did he seem to remember where he was. "Eleanor," he said, his voice urgent now, "I need you to listen to me carefully. Those men, they're dangerous. More dangerous than you can imagine. I want you to stay close to town until they're gone. Don't go anywhere alone, especially not after dark." "John, you're scaring me." "Good. You should be scared." John gripped her shoulders, his fingers digging in with desperate intensity. "Promise me, Eleanor. Promise me you'll be careful." She nodded, though her mind was spinning with questions she didn't know how to ask. "I promise." "But John, who are they? Why are they here?" John released her and stepped back, and Eleanor watched in heartbreak as the walls went up behind his eyes again. The vulnerable man who had almost confessed his secrets was gone, replaced by the hard-eyed sheriff she barely recognized. "They're here for me," he said simply. "And before this is over, you're going to wish you'd never met me." The next morning brought no relief from the tension that had settled over Millbrook like a burial shroud. Eleanor tried to focus on her lessons, but her mind kept drifting to John's haunted expression, to the way that stranger had called him Jack, to the growing certainty that the man she loved was carrying secrets that could destroy them both. It was during the afternoon spelling lesson that one of her students, Mary Patterson, raised her hand with obvious excitement. "Miss Hayes, my mama sent me to tell you that those new men in town have been asking about you." Eleanor's blood turned to ice water. "Asking about me?" "Yes, ma'am. They want to know where you live, what times you walk to and from school, whether you have any family nearby." Mary's young face was bright with the importance of her message, oblivious to the fear it was causing her teacher. Eleanor forced her voice to remain calm. "What did your mother tell them?" "She told them to mind their own business and get out of her store." "But Miss Hayes, they didn't look like the kind of men who give up easy." The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of barely controlled panic. Eleanor dismissed the children early and locked the schoolhouse door behind them, her hands shaking as she turned the key. The wanted posters on her wall seemed to mock her with their silent faces, reminders of a violent world she'd thought herself safe from. As darkness fell over Millbrook, Eleanor sat in her room above the schoolhouse, a lamp burning low on her table and John's warnings echoing in her mind. She'd pulled the curtains tight, but still felt exposed, vulnerable, like a mouse waiting for the owl's shadow to pass overhead. The soft knock on her door nearly made her heart stop. "Eleanor." John's voice was muffled through the wood. "It's me." She opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, his face grim in the lamplight. He'd strapped on his gun belt. She noticed something he rarely wore in town. "I heard they were asking about you," he said without preamble. "I've come to take you somewhere safe." "Safe from what, John?" "Who are these men?" John was quiet for a moment, then stepped closer, his eyes searching her face as if trying to memorize every detail. "They're the kind of men who use innocent people to get what they want. And what they want is me." Eleanor felt the last pieces of her carefully ordered world beginning to crumble. "Why, John? Why do they want you?" "Because," John said, his voice breaking on the word, "a long time ago, we used to ride together." The confession hung in the air between them like a loaded gun, and Eleanor felt the full weight of what he was telling her. The man she loved, the sheriff who had sworn to protect their town, had once been an outlaw himself. "How long ago?" she whispered. 5 years. "I left the gang 5 years ago and never looked back. I thought I'd buried that life forever." Eleanor stared at him, seeing him clearly for the first time. The careful way he held himself, the watchfulness in his eyes, the skill with which he handled his gun, all of it made terrible sense now. "What did you do?" she asked. "When you rode with them, what did you do?" John's shoulders sagged as if the weight of his confession had finally broken something inside him. "Everything they're going to say I did. Everything and worse." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending shadows dancing across the walls. Eleanor closed her eyes, trying to reconcile the gentle man who had courted her with patient devotion with the outlaw past he was confessing. When she opened them again, John was watching her with the expression of a man awaiting execution. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now," John said, checking his gun one more time, "I try to keep you alive long enough to hate me properly." The sound of hoofbeats in the street below made them both freeze. Through the thin curtains, Eleanor could see the shapes of 3 riders moving slowly through the darkness, circling the schoolhouse like vultures around carrion. The past had finally caught up with John Morrison, and Eleanor Hayes was about to learn that sometimes the greatest test of love isn't whether you can forgive someone's mistakes, it's whether you can survive them. When Eleanor discovered the sheriff's badge belonged to the very outlaw she'd taught her students to despise, she had to choose between everything she believed and everything she'd learned to love. The photograph fell from John's coat pocket like a judgment from heaven, landing face up on Eleanor's schoolroom floor. In the lamplight, she could see 3 men standing beside their horses, younger versions of the strangers who now haunted Millbrook streets. And there, in the center, unmistakable despite the years and the careful grooming that had softened his features, stood John Morrison. But the name carved into the bottom of the photograph in faded ink wasn't John Morrison at all. It was Jack Morrison. Black Jack Morrison. Eleanor's knees buckled, and she gripped the edge of her desk to keep from falling. The wanted poster on her wall seemed to mock her with its hollow-eyed stare. The same eyes that had looked at her with love, the same hands that had touched her face with desperate tenderness, the same voice that had whispered her name like a prayer. Eleanor. John's voice came from behind her, heavy with the weight of discovery. I can explain. She turned slowly, the photograph trembling in her grip. Can you? Can you explain how the man I've been teaching my students to hate is the same man I've been falling in love with? John stood in the doorway like a man facing his own execution, his sheriff's badge catching the light in cruel irony. I wanted to tell you. God knows I tried 100 times. When Eleanor's voice rose, years of certainty crumbling like sand castles before the tide. When you sat in that chair, helping Jimmy with his arithmetic. When you walked me home in the evenings. When you kissed me under the stars and made me believe in fairy tales. Every moment with you has been real, Eleanor. Every word, every touch, every lie. She threw the photograph at his feet, watching it flutter like a dying bird. How many people have you killed, Jack? How many families have you destroyed while I stood here preaching about justice and righteousness? John flinched as if she'd struck him. More than I can count. More than I can ever make right. The confession hung in the air between them like a death sentence. Eleanor stared at this stranger wearing the face of the man she loved, trying to reconcile the gentle sheriff with the notorious outlaw whose crimes had terrorized the territory for years. The stagecoach robbery last month, she whispered. You weren't hunting Black Jack Morrison. You were covering for him. No. John stepped forward, then stopped when she backed away. Eleanor, I swear to you, I haven't committed a crime in 5 years. I left that life behind when I came to Millbrook. I became sheriff to try to make amends for what I'd done. By lying to everyone, by letting the real Black Jack Morrison walk free while innocent people suffer. By trying to become a man you believed me to be, John said quietly. By trying to deserve the love you gave so freely. Outside, the sound of approaching horses made them both freeze. Through the window, Eleanor could see torches moving through the darkness. 3 riders making no attempt at stealth now, their purpose clear in the deliberate way they approached the schoolhouse. They're coming for me, John said, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. Eleanor, you need to get out of here. Now, why should I run? I'm not the criminal. The words came out harder than she'd intended, and she saw them land like physical blows. John nodded slowly, accepting the judgment in her voice. You're right. You're not. But they'll use you to get to me, and I won't let that happen. The door burst open before Eleanor could respond. The silver-bearded man she now recognized as Jake Holloway filled the entrance, flanked by his 2 companions. Their guns were drawn, and their faces carried the cold satisfaction of hunters who had cornered their prey. Well, Holloway drawled, his eyes moving between Eleanor and John. If it ain't Black Jack Morrison, playing dress-up as a lawman. And this must be the pretty little schoolmarm we've been hearing so much about. John positioned himself between Eleanor and the outlaws, his own weapon clearing leather with practiced speed. Let her go, Jake. Your quarrel is with me. Is it, though? Holloway's smile was cold as winter wind. See, Jack, when you abandoned your brothers, you cost us more than just your gun. That job in Silver Creek went sideways because we were 1 man short. 3 of our boys are dead because of your conscience. Those men made their own choices, same as I made mine. Did they? Or did they die because their leader decided to play sheriff in some dusty town? Holloway's gun swung toward Eleanor, and she felt her blood turn to ice. "Seems to me you owe us a debt, Jack. And debt's got to be paid." Eleanor watched in fascination and horror as John's entire demeanor changed. The gentle man she'd known vanished, replaced by someone harder, more dangerous, someone who belonged on a wanted poster. "You want to settle accounts? We'll settle them," John said, his voice carrying a deadly calm. But the woman walks away first. "I don't think so." Holloway's companions spread out, covering the room's exits. "See, we've been watching you, Jack. Watching how you look at her, how you light up when she's around. This pretty little thing is your weakness, and weakness is something we can use." Eleanor felt the weight of her own naivety crushing down on her. All those passionate speeches about justice, all those moral certainties she'd held so dear, and here she stood, caught between the man she loved and the law she'd sworn to uphold. "What do you want?" John asked. "One last job. The bank in Cedar Ridge. They've got a shipment of gold coming in next week, and we need your expertise to get it." Holloway's smile widened. "Do this one job with us, and we'll disappear forever. Refuse, and your little schoolmarm pays the price." Eleanor watched John's face as he weighed the impossible choice. She could see the calculations running behind his eyes, the desperate search for a way out that wouldn't end in blood. "There's another option," she said quietly. Both men turned to stare at her, and Eleanor felt the full weight of their attention like a physical force. Her heart was pounding, but her voice remained steady as she made her choice. "Turn yourself in, John. Face justice for what you've done." The silence that followed was deafening. Holloway laughed first, a sound like breaking glass. "Well, I'll be damned. The little schoolmarm wants to send her boyfriend to the gallows. That's cold, lady. Colder than anything we've ever done." But John was staring at Eleanor with something like wonder in his eyes. "You'd do that? You'd see me hang for what I've been. I'd see you live with honor instead of dying with shame," Eleanor replied. "I'd see you face the consequences of your choices instead of running from them forever." For a moment, John looked like a man seeing sunlight after years in darkness. Then Holloway's harsh laughter shattered the spell. "Touching, really. But we didn't come here for a Sunday sermon. Jack, you've got 10 seconds to decide. The job or the girl dies." The gun in Holloway's hand swung toward Eleanor, and time seemed to slow to a crawl. She saw John's face change, saw his hand move toward his weapon, saw the other two outlaws beginning to draw their guns. What happened next unfolded like a deadly dance that had been choreographed in hell. John's gun cleared leather first, but instead of aiming at Holloway, he turned it on the lamp sitting on Eleanor's desk. The room plunged into darkness as glass shattered and oil spread flames across the wooden floor. "Run!" John shouted, and Eleanor heard the thunder of gunfire exploding around her. She stumbled toward the back door, smoke already beginning to fill the small room. Behind her, muzzle flashes lit the darkness like deadly lightning, and the sound of men shouting and cursing echoed off the walls. Eleanor burst out into the cold night air and immediately began screaming for help. Lights appeared in windows throughout Millbrook as the townspeople awakened to the sound of gunfire and the growing glow of flames from their schoolhouse. The battle inside seemed to last forever, though it couldn't have been more than a few minutes. When the shooting finally stopped, Eleanor found herself surrounded by half the town, all of them staring at the burning building in shock and fear. "Miss Hayes." Doc Miller grabbed her shoulders, checking her for injuries. "Are you hurt? What happened?" Before she could answer, a figure stumbled out of the smoke-filled doorway. It was John, his clothes singed and his left arm hanging uselessly at his side. Behind him, the schoolhouse was fully engulfed in flames. "The outlaws," someone called. "Where are the outlaws?" John looked at Eleanor across the crowd of townspeople, and she saw everything in his eyes: love, regret, acceptance, and goodbye. "Dead," he said simply. "All three of them." Mayor Hutchins pushed through the crowd, his nightshirt flapping around his knees. "Sheriff Morrison, what in God's name happened here?" John straightened despite his obvious pain, and Eleanor watched as he made his final choice. Slowly, deliberately, he unpinned the sheriff's badge from his vest and held it out to the mayor. "My name isn't John Morrison," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "It's Jack Morrison. Black Jack Morrison. And I surrender myself to the people of Millbrook for judgment." The crowd erupted in shocked murmurs and angry shouts, but Eleanor heard none of it. She was staring at the man she'd loved, watching him choose honor over escape, justice over survival. Doc Miller moved forward to tend John's wounds, but several of the townsmen blocked his path. "Don't touch him," someone yelled. "He's an outlaw. He's a wounded man," Eleanor said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. She pushed through the crowd, ignoring the gasps and protests, and took John's good arm. "And he just saved my life." She led him to Doc Miller's office, the crowd following like an angry mob. But as they walked through the streets of Millbrook, Eleanor noticed something that gave her hope. Not everyone was shouting for John's blood. Some of the faces in the crowd showed confusion, even sympathy. These people had known John Morrison, the sheriff, for months. They'd seen him help their children, protect their families, serve their community with quiet dedication. The revelation of his past didn't erase the good he'd done in their present. 3 days later, Eleanor sat in the front row of the makeshift courtroom they'd set up in the church. John sat in the defendant's chair, his arm in a sling, but his back straight with dignity. He'd confessed to everything, every robbery, every crime, every sin he could remember. But he'd also had character witnesses, dozens of them. Townspeople who spoke of his kindness, his integrity, the way he'd risked his life to protect them. Doc Miller testified about the medical supplies John had quietly purchased for families who couldn't afford them. Mrs. Patterson spoke about how he'd helped her son learn to read. And Eleanor testified too. Not about his crimes, those he confessed freely, but about his character, about the man she'd come to know, about the capacity for change and redemption that lived in every human heart. The territorial judge listened to it all with the patience of Solomon, weighing justice against mercy, law against grace. In the end, John Morrison was sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison, with the possibility of parole for good behavior. It wasn't the hanging some had called for, but it wasn't freedom either. As they led him away in chains, John stopped beside Eleanor's pew. "Will you wait for me?" he asked quietly. Eleanor looked up at him, this complicated man who had taught her that the world was painted in shades of gray rather than stark black and white, who had shown her that love could exist alongside justice, that redemption was possible even for the most hardened heart. "I'll be here," she promised, "however long it takes." John smiled then, the first real smile she'd seen from him since his past had come calling. "Thank you. For everything. For seeing the man I was trying to become instead of just the man I used to be." 5 years later, Eleanor stood on the platform of the Millbrook train station, watching the morning express pull slowly to a stop. When John Morrison stepped down from the passenger car, he was older, grayer, marked by his time in prison, but not broken by it. He saw her immediately, his eyes finding hers across the crowded platform. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, measuring the changes that time and trial had wrought. Then Eleanor smiled and walked toward him, her hand extended in greeting and promise. "Welcome home, John Morrison," she said. And in her voice, he heard not just forgiveness, but the possibility of a love that had been tested by fire and found true. The prairie wind whispered around them, carrying with it the scent of new beginnings and the promise that sometimes justice and mercy could dance together under the endless western sky. In the end, Eleanor Hayes had learned the most important lesson of all, that the greatest teachers are not found in schoolhouses, but in the courage to love someone not despite their past, but because of how they choose to face their future.